Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to today's live stream. This week we're working on beginners topics for everybody. So today's going to be an awesome introduction if you're brand new to Blender. So let's jump in a little bit and get started. Okay, so before we get going on today's topics, I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, why I'm here, what I'm doing this for, and then we'll jump really quickly into some overviews and some Blender basics. And if at any time during the live stream you guys have a question, just write me in the chat and I'll stop and respond as we go. So let's pull over to my screen here. So my name is Brandon Hicks. I'm a Blender Foundation certified trainer, and I've been using Blender for the better part of 13 or so years. And so what I have done is started a business around training people on how to use Blender. And so we are called the Orange Guild. And if you find us at theorangeguild.com, we've got some exciting things to share with you as far as training and support if you're getting into being a Blender artist. So let's take a look a little bit at the website here. If you go to the homepage, you can sign up for a free account here or here, and you'll get access to free tutorials and things like that as we release them. You can subscribe to our mailing list right here. And if you join the mailing list, you'll get a free month trial of the Orange Guild on us. And so that's awesome. And that'll come straight to your inbox. And also, if you're watching on YouTube right now, if you go to the bottom in the description below, you will see a link there, which is the same thing. So if you want to get the free trial there, it's available. But if you look at the membership, we've got some awesome benefits, unlimited 24/7 access to all of our tutorials and courses. If you're a member, you'll get exclusive downloadable assets and resources. They're only available to people that are on the inside. And then, of course, we have our special Ask a Mentor area where you can give us questions directly. We'll get back to you one-on-one about things that are specific to your workflow. And we'll also help you by critiquing your work. So if you're working on a project for school or for your freelance career or whatever you're doing, we'll help you kind of level up that project as you go. So all the benefits are labeled right here. If you do want to join permanently, you can do it. It's $9 a month, super cheap, less than the price of a Netflix subscription at this point. You can do a yearly subscription for $99 a year. And quite honestly, for the amount of training you're getting, that's an incredible deal. So check out the training section. It's got all of our courses that are currently live. We're always working on more. I'm working on recruiting new instructors. So these are all me in terms of teaching, but we're going to have more people coming in and teaching as well. So right now, if you want to head to theorangeguild.com and sign up, this is where you do it. Okay, so let's get into what we're here to talk about today, which is Blender. So Blender is a free 3D software that you can find at blender.org. And if you go to blender.org, you can download 2.79b, which at the time of this live stream is the latest version. And so if you're following along, I would recommend you go straight to this website, download this here on the homepage. You can also go to the downloads section right here, and then pick an appropriate download based on your operating system. So this will probably tell you whatever operating system you're using. In this case, I'm using Windows, so that's what it's showing. But you can download it here and install it. It's free, it's open source, and it's constantly updated with amazing new features. So this is where you would get Blender to get started. So I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of a primer on the 3D production pipeline and basically what we're doing here today before we jump into Blender and get started. And then we will carry on. So let me switch my screen over a little bit here. And let me pull my notes up so we can get that started. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about two major topics, and one is the sort of production cycle that you're going to see in any sort of production for a project, whether it be you know, a 3D illustration, video game, visual effects projects for film, anything you can think of. Basically, there is a sort of system that's outlined that fits all of those projects, and that's what we're going to talk about first. So let's dive into that. And basically on the left, you're going to see that we have 3 big phases as far as this goes. So if I label these 1, 2, and 3, you can see first we have pre-production, and this is basically what you can think of as the planning cycle for the project that you're currently working on. After that comes production, which is where you're going to spend maybe the bulk of your time in creating whatever the project is that you're working on. And then after that, we're going to have post-production, and this is basically where you polish up your main project here. So this is going to change and kind of fluctuate depending on what project you're working on. And if we start looking at some examples, you see how the time breaks down differently. So let's say we're working on a 3D illustration, okay? So this is what I spend a lot of my time doing, and this is basically just one still image that's made up of 3D objects, and we're gonna save that as like a painting or a 2D image. And so 3D illustration for all 3 of these phases. Let's look at how the time breaks down and how it differentiates itself. So with pre-production, I might spend 20% of my time in the project really researching and figuring out what I'm going to do and how I'm going to go about doing it. This is where I get my game plan together. And then after that, for production, I might spend 70% of my time building things out, making things look pretty, and then getting my project to a good level. And then I might spend the last 10% trying to get things polished up before I share it with the world, right? And so altogether, that is where the bulk of the time is broken down. But it's different depending on which project that you're working on. So that's for 3D illustration. For something like VFX, for film, the breakdown is going to change a little bit. So for VFX for film, for pre-production happens for this and is fairly well thought out way before we get to VFX, because VFX is mostly a post-production process in a film. So for pre-production, we're going to have a little bit of time that we spend before we jump into post, talking to the director, talking to the producers, and trying to get a feel for what we need to do to get all of this done. So maybe we have 10% of our time spent here talking and making a plan. Production, which is really post-production in the case of VFX, because that's a post-production process, is going to maybe spend 80% of your time here making it look really, really decent. And then again, you'd have about 10% you might spend here polishing it up and going back and forth. Now this will change depending on what kind of VFX project you're working on, how big your team is, things like that. So sometimes the breakdown can look a lot different than this. So let's take another example for VFX. Sometimes you might have a 10% breakdown here, and then you might have a 50% breakdown here. And then you might have the remaining 40% spent kind of going back and forth in sort of a circular cycle here, because you're refining the end product all the way till the release date down here somewhere. And so it all depends on the project you're working on. If we're looking at a game that we're developing, there's going to be a whole lot of time spent in pre-production. Same for if we're doing an entire movie instead of just the post-production. We need to plan out characters, levels, all sorts of things. And so you might spend 30% of your time in pre-production on a game. You might spend 50%, or actually, let's say there's a lot more time spent here. So let's say 70% here for the production cycle. Actually, that's already at 100. So let's instead call this 60%. And then again, for a game, maybe you have 10% here. And post-production for a game could be the marketing that we have to do towards the end of the project. It could be all of the assets that we create after the main bulk of the gameplay is finished, for cutscenes or things like that we're doing for the game, or maybe just polishing things up that we didn't have time for earlier on in the production cycle. So this all changes, and that's really the kind of point that I'm trying to make here, is that any of these big digital projects that you're going to get involved in when you're using Blender are typically going to have these 3 steps. And just know that your time at each of these phases can change depending on the type of project that you're working on. So that's all I got on that. Now let's talk about a really important topic, which is the 3D production pipeline. And we're not going to have time to go into a whole lot of specifics on this. I am going to try to give a few examples as we go, but let's talk about the 8 or so steps that I'm going to lay out for you today as far as what it takes to get a project in 3D finished to a final level. So all the way from the beginning, we're done planning. Now it's time to jump in and start actually working on this project. What are the actual steps that take us from beginning to end to get that final product, regardless of whatever it is we're working on? So we'll start with step 1 here. Step 1 is modeling. Now, modeling is basically, in a nutshell, creating 3D objects and the environment in which they're placed. So this can be people, cars, as far as the objects go. And then for the environment, we could have cities, could just have an entire planet. If it's a game, we could have levels. And so all of these things have to be created, and they are going to represent what we see when we're inside of a 3D project. That's going to lead you into the next phase, which is texturing. Now, texturing in a nutshell can be thought of as taking the models that we've already created and we're going to paint them. And so in this case, you can think of texturing as something that is customizing how these models look. And so if we're looking at people, we're going to think about people's skin. Okay? So let me clean this up a little bit. So people, it would be skin. For cities, you know, we would have part of the city would be the signs. And so we're going to have signs that have specific looks to them, stop signs and yield signs and things like that, road signs. And those are all going to have specific textures painted for those. Planet, we would have, you know, continents, clouds. And this would be obviously from a distance that we're painting those and things like that. Levels, we're going to have lots of things like, let's think about dirt. Let's think about, let's see, we've got walls, and those walls have patterns for tiles and wallpaper and things like that. Same with the floors. And we've got stains, you know, maybe there's, if it's a gory game, you got blood and all sorts of other stuff like that. Those are all textures, okay? So that's going to lead you into shading. And these are, relatively speaking, these are all kind of in order. So you're going down as you go, and one of these is going to lead into the next. Now, shading is different from texturing. Texturing deals specifically with customizing these objects with textures that are only going to work specifically for those objects by themselves. Shading, we're thinking about preparing the look of the objects, and this is going to be based on materials. And so this is more generalized. If we're looking at shading, we're looking at things like how to make metal look like metal, how to make plastic look like plastic, and then we're going to look at anything you would think of. Water, how do we make water look like water? It's got a lot of different characteristics. It's transparent compared to these solid objects, and all sorts of stuff like that. So shading is sort of in between texturing and the next phase, which is lighting. So lighting is shading is sort of a hybrid of texturing and lighting. It's sort of an in-between stage, because it's going to take textures and lighting together to let you know how your shading is looking in your scene. The lighting is obviously going to be the types of light that are in your 3D environment that are helping you to be able to see your objects, because without light, you can't really see anything. So obviously, if we're outside, we have the sun, that's a light. We also have the environment itself. So you can think of the ozone layer bouncing around, blue light that's sort of reflecting around. That's a light source. It's an indirect light source. We would also have lamps in the scene. So on a film set, sometimes these are called practicals. Okay. These are lamps that you would typically see out, as an object. So maybe you have to model a lamp fixture and a light bulb, and then you would, have that emit light as a lamp in your scene. Okay, so it's kind of both in this case. And so these are just some typical objects that you would find in your scene that are sharing light, right? And then you've got special objects like fire that would also be spilling light into the scene. So it all depends on what you've got going on. After lighting, you're going to get into two things that are sort of linked, and these are called rigging and animation. Now, you don't always have these two steps. It depends on whether or not you're doing something with animation. Sometimes you're not. A lot of times I have projects that are just 3D illustrations, and so nothing's moving in the scene. It's just a still image. But if you're going to be doing any sort of animated feature films, or you're doing any game development where you're creating characters that run around in a level and things like that, you're going to have what's called rigging and animation. So rigging is basically the step that allows you to take an object that's just standing around and then put the mechanics together so it can move, which then will let you move it around in this step. So with rigging, we're thinking about adding bones to people or mechanics to things like robots, right? So bones, we got people, we got animals, and they're gonna need skeletons, right? Skeletal structures to help them move around. Otherwise, their skin is basically just gonna fall to the ground. There's really not a way to accurately move them around. So the best way to sort of get at creating a realistic human being or an animal is to just recreate the bones that they would actually have in the real world. Same thing for robots. So with robots, we have mechanics, and mechanics might be things like motors or gears or joints. Some of those might be modeled over up here for the object, but then we need to think about how we're going to connect all those pieces up and get them to move around, sort of like you would with people over here. So that's the rigging step, and that's helping objects be prepared to move. And then at the animation stage, you're actually going to take your objects and you're going to move them around your scene. And so here we've got, character animation. We've got vehicles moving around the scene. If you're doing a video game with a race, you've got vehicles sort of drifting around the track and things like that. Those are animations that you create. You've also got environmental animations. So you've got the sunlight changing position in the sky. And actually what it would, be in the real world is the sun appearing to change position. But of course, we're spinning and we're rotating on the earth. So, but we have to simulate that in the game. So we would actually move the spherical sun through the sky in a certain way. And this also covers what are called simulations. So this is sort of an in-between step and a little bit more customized. So for simulations, what we have are things like fire and smoke and explosions, fracturing objects like a car crash or a mirror, earthquakes, like all that kind of stuff is a simulation. And there's a lot of different kinds of simulations. You can think of tornadoes, anything that's basically weather-based. You would have sort of a randomized, chaotic type of simulation that you're trying to wrangle in some big system like that. And typically for this, you use something that's called particles to help you create these sort of fantastical effects. Okay, so after animation, there's a couple more steps. So once you've got all of this stuff done, which is basically everything up until rendering and the next step, you basically have production, right, in the 3D production pipeline. So once we've got everything up until here finished, we've basically been creating the scene. At this point, we're gonna make sure that we save a version of this out so that we can actually see what we've done. And this is where we actually save out a movie or an image of our work. And so this is basically just the process of saving everything that we've done so far. And this is gonna be at a much, instead of a preview level, it's gonna be at a much higher resolution finished level here. And then we get to the final step where once we have all of our images saved on our computer, we're going to do what's called compositing. And compositing is basically adding polish to the final video or image. And so again, I say video or image because you can have an animated film, think of like a Pixar movie, would be a video. And then an image, again, would just be a still. So front of a video game, box, piece of art, something like that. That's what a still image would be. And that's taking 3D stuff and then making it into a final still that we're going to use like a painting. And so at this step, we're thinking about doing things like color correction. We're thinking about doing things like adding visual effects if we need to. So this would be like glowing lights in the scene, flares, lens flares, things like that. Anything and everything we need to do to fix things. So one of the other things we do a lot in post-production is something called rotoscoping, which is basically like painting out the things that are not as they should be, so we can either fix them or replace them with something, things like that. So if there's something that hasn't quite turned out the way you expected at this stage, doing something like rotoscoping, something like that can help you fix that up. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the entire 3D production pipeline. And this is the process that every single 3D based project takes from beginning to end, whether you're talking about a Pixar movie or whether you're talking about a AAA game, PUBG, whatever it is. This is the steps they have to go through to get it all the way through to developing it out and creating a final product. And so now that we've kind of taken a look at how this works, let's go ahead and jump into Blender. And I'm going to give you guys a basic rundown of how to jump into the program and start using it. Okay. Okay. So if you've downloaded the latest version of Blender as of this stream, it should be 2.79b. And when you open it, you can see what is the splash screen, which is right here. And so to get rid of this, all you need to do is just left click somewhere in the background over here, and that'll get rid of the splash screen. And if you look up at the top, you'll see version 2.79, and that'll tell you what version you're currently using. So that's what it should say. That's what it should say. All right, so let's get a little bit into how we're going to use Blender here. And I'm going to do my best not to use any sort of keyboard shortcuts or anything that's kind of getting into intermediate stuff, because I want to make sure everybody can follow along at a really easy pace. And so you should see pretty much the same screen that I have here when you launch. Usually starts out with a cube in the middle. I've got a few extra menus over here, so I don't want you guys to worry about that, but this is what you're going to see. So at first glance, it might look a little intimidating. There's a lot of buttons and a lot of panels on the screen and things like that, but don't worry about it. We're going to take it nice and easy, and I'm going to walk you through how to start using stuff. And so Blender Basics, basically there's a lot of menus, and if you want to kind of just start browsing through them, all you have to do is sort of left click on any of these buttons, and you can kind of get into the menus. And so up at the top, in the top left, you've got what you would typically see in any kind of program. You got a file menu here for saving and opening things and quitting the program, things like that. And so this is where you would typically start a little bit. And then you've got some other menus here that help you. There's a help menu. So this will take you straight to the Blender manual online. And so if you have anything you want to look up, you can check that out. And so there's a lot of other stuff. Let's get into how we can actually start moving around and doing some things inside Blender. So Blender is an interesting program. And basically what you're going to have is you're going to have your keyboard and your mouse typically are going to be used pretty much 50-50 with the program. And so today I'm going to try to use mostly just my mouse, so there's no keyboard shortcuts or anything like that. And one of the first things I like to show people how to do is kind of how to move around in the 3D viewport. And so there's three main things you can do in the 3D viewport. You can rotate around, you can zoom in and out, and then you can move around just like this, okay? So what I like to show people how to do is use their mouse to kind of help them out with this. And what you need to do first if you want to rotate around in your screen is you need to use your middle mouse button. So for Blender, typically you need to be on a 3-button mouse. There are ways to help you do it if you have a laptop, but I would highly recommend working with a 3-button mouse at a desktop computer for this. And all you have to do is use your scroll wheel. So you just click that middle mouse button and drag, and that'll help you rotate around the screen just like this. And it's the same button if you want to zoom in and out. And so if you want to zoom in and out, you just scroll up or down for in and out, just like this. And then again, if you want to move around the screen, all you have to do is use your middle mouse button while you're clicking, and you add an extra button on your keyboard. And in this case, it's just the shift button. So hold shift and then left click on the middle mouse button and drag. And that's how you start moving around just like this. And as soon as you release your buttons, it'll stop and then you can start moving around again. So one more time, basically to rotate around in your 3D viewport, use the middle mouse button, you just left click and rotate. As you drag, you'll rotate. Zooming in and out is with the scroll wheel, just like it is on pretty much every other application. And then to move around the scene, you can hold shift and middle click and move around just like this. Up, down, left, right, just like this. Okay, so those are the 3 basic things you need to know. And what I'm gonna do right now is turn on the, there's a little shortcut down here that'll show you what I'm doing. So I'm going to turn that on so you can see that as I start kind of moving around. And if I forget to, and I accidentally use a keyboard shortcut, it'll show you what it is down here, but I'm going to try not to do that. So once again, if you look at this little mouse icon down here, I'm just using my middle mouse button to rotate. And then I'm scrolling with the middle mouse button to zoom in and out. And then I'm holding shift and middle mouse button, clicking and dragging to move around, okay? So those are the 3 main things you need to know to be able to get around in the 3D viewport. Now you can actually do a lot of things by using some of the menus down here at the bottom. So if you go to view, you'll have all of these options for what you can do in terms of viewing things in the 3D viewport over here. So if we get a view, you can check out top, bottom, front, back, right, left. And if you just look at these options, we click top, that'll take you and put you in sort of a top view over here. If we click right, that'll take you and put you on the right side of the cube. And so you can navigate using just the menu down here in the lower left-hand corner. If we have a camera in the scene, this will help you look through the camera. So you can click that. And so a lot of other really cool options in here you can play with on your own time. But basically, there's a lot of things that you can find in the menus if you have trouble remembering how to do them while you're working on your scene here. So we'll move around, we'll zoom in and out, and then we'll hold shift and middle click to get around. And now let's talk a little bit about how we can play with some objects here. And so to select an object, this cube right here is not actually selected right now. So to select this, we just need to right click on the object and you'll see a big orange outline all the way around the outside of it. And that'll show you that this object is currently selected. You're also going to see what is called the global manipulation sort of widget pop up right here in the middle. And that'll let you know that you can drag on any one of these arrows and that will let you move this object around the scene. And so right click is what you use to select, and left click is what you can use on any of these arrows to sort of start dragging this around the scene. So I'm just left clicking and dragging this object by these different arrows. And something you'll need to get kind of familiar with as you get in and play with these axes. If you look down in the lower left-hand corner, you'll see a little representation of this widget. And it says X on the red, Y for green, and on Z you'll see blue. And that's just a color coordinated way for Blender to tell you that Z is up and down, Y is sort of in and out, and red is X for left and right. Now this will change depending on how you're rotated around in your 3D viewport, but basically anytime you see green, it means you're on the y-axis. Anytime you see red, it means you're on the x-axis. And anytime you see blue, it means you're on the z-axis. So you'll also notice on the grid out here in the 3D viewport, we have a red line and a green line, and that's letting you know, again, you're on the x-axis here, this direction, and you're on the y-axis here. So those all mean the same thing. One of the other things you're going to get used to using in Blender is something called the 3D cursor. So you see this little crosshair that has the red and white dotted lines around it. This, if you left click at any point in time, anywhere in your screen, you're going to see this move around and snap to wherever your cursor is at that point. This is a little manipulator widget that can help you do extra functions as you start playing with objects in your scene. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But for now, if you want to kind of get it out of the way, you can just zoom out, click off to the side over here, and then zoom back in. And so now we're just playing with moving this around the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. What's great about this little manipulation widget is that you can actually change what it does. So right now we're just moving this cube around. But if you want to rotate the cube, you can jump down to this little menu down here. And right now we have it set to translate or move. And if you want to click on this little icon with a curve on it, that'll switch the global manipulation widget to a rotate function. So now, again, X is on the red. We want to left click and drag. We can rotate this on the x-axis, or we can rotate it on the y-axis or the z-axis. And this little white line will let you rotate based on your custom view that you're rotated into right now. So you'll see how there's always a perfectly white circle all the way around, stays in place. And that means I can get into a custom angle in my viewport and then just click on this white circle and it will rotate it around that custom viewpoint. So once we have the object kind of moved in position, we can rotate it in a position, we can also scale it. So if we click this little icon, this will change it into a scale operation. And we can actually scale our objects using the x-axis or the y-axis or the z-axis. And so using just this one manipulation little icon, you're able to move, rotate, and scale using just your mouse right here. If this is in the way, you can also click on this little icon here and that will turn it off. So you can turn this off and on just like this. So that's a basic way to kind of get that, that object moved around in space. Now let's talk a little bit about how you might dial in some of those values a little bit more accurately. So if we look on the right side over here, you'll see this little plus icon. So let's click that and you'll see this little menu pop up. And this is called the properties window or panel. And so basically when we have an object selected, the location, the rotation, and the scale of the object is going to be displayed right here. And so if we start off by zeroing these all out, so I can type in 0 here, left click on one of these numbers, and that'll kind of let me input a number on my own. So on my keyboard, I'm just going to type in 0 and enter. And then here, 0 and enter. And that's going to basically zero this back out to where it's in the middle of our world here. Okay. We can do the same thing on the rotation. So if we just hit 0, 0, and 0, that's going to clear out the rotation that we typed in or we used on the widget here. Right. So you can see that changing on the Z on the rotation over here. So if you watch this number as I rotate, you can see that changing. So anytime we want to accurately enter a number, we can just zero these out. Same thing on the scale. This will start off with a cube at 1, 1, and 1. So if we just leave these at 1, 1, and 1, that will give us back our accurate cube here. Okay, so we've learned a little bit about how to move around the viewport. We've learned a little bit about how we can use this tool here to move, rotate, and scale an object. And we've learned a little bit about how we can custom place our objects somewhere in the scene over here using specific values. So let's talk about adding and removing objects, okay? So to add and remove an object, we can go through the menus and use the delete command. So let's say I want to get rid of this cube and start off with something else. We can go to objects over here, and then we're going to look for the delete command, which is right here, sort of in the middle. So we can click delete. It's going to ask us, are we sure we want to do that? And we just left click and say delete. Now that's going to be gone. Okay. And now we want to add in a new object. So what we're going to do is we can go back to the menus down here. We can go to add, and then we can go to mesh and then pick one of these objects up here at the top. And so we had a cube, and let's say instead we wanted a sphere. We could pick a sphere here, and now you can see that we've got a sphere. And the same things we were doing to the cube, we can now do to the sphere as well. If we want to scale this up and down, we can do that. We can move it around, rotate it, and of course we can do that all custom over here as well by typing in those values. So that's how you add and delete objects, is using the delete command, which is right here. And then if you want to create something, you can also use this create tab over here on the left. So if you don't want to have to go digging through the add menu over here, you can jump over to the create tab and the tools palette. And if this ever goes away, this tools palette, it's the same way as it is over here with the properties palette. You just click this little plus icon and that will come back, okay? So just left click and that'll come back. You can also hide these if you want to drag them all the way over. They'll eventually collapse down into the interface. And then to bring them back, just again, left click on those little plus signs. So this is interesting. Wherever your 3D cursor is in the 3D viewport, you can see that kind of floating in space right now. Wherever your 3D cursor is, that's where, when you create an object, it will be placed in the scene. And so if we want to click add a plane, which is the flat two-dimensional object, wherever our 3D cursor is, the center of that plane will appear right there, okay? And then again, we can add multiple objects. So let's say we want to start adding in a bunch of objects around the scene. We can left click somewhere else, and then let's say we add a cube, and then now we have 2 objects in the scene. And let's say somewhere over here, we want to add a sphere. So we'll just left click, and then click sphere, and then we'll add that right there. And so you can see all 3 of those objects are now part of the same scene. And so now if we just want to select different objects, we can just right click on any of these and that will select them in the 3D viewport. So as we are wanting to play with these objects, we have to make sure we have the right one selected as we're getting in here and playing around. So once we have one of these selected, anything we do in these properties over here are going to affect just this object. So we have to make sure we have the right one selected as we are playing with these. And we can just add an infinite number of objects based on over here. So we got lots of different objects to add. You can add a circle, which is basically just a bunch of points that aren't actually have any faces yet. We'll talk a little bit about what that means later. So let's click over here. We can add a UV sphere, which we already did. So let's add an icosphere, which is a little bit different kind of sphere here. Left click over here. We can add a cylinder, and then a cone, and then a torus. And so you can see just all of these objects are able to be added or removed as we want. So again, to delete an object, make sure you have it selected with right click, and then under object, you can just hit delete here in the menu. Now, another thing that you'll need to start learning are things called keyboard shortcuts, because these will actually really speed you up as you're getting in here and playing with objects in Blender. And so as we're playing with some of these objects and deleting them, instead of having to go dig through this object menu every time we want to delete something, you'll notice if we go into this menu under the delete command, if we look on the right side over here, there is an X, and that's telling you the keyboard shortcut for deleting an object. And so like you might think, if you have an object selected and you hit X on your keyboard, it's basically going to be the same thing as clicking that in the object menu. It's going to ask you if you want to delete it, and you can just click left to confirm that you want to delete that. And so that's how you delete all of these objects. It's just X, left click, and so on and so forth until you have all these objects deleted. Okay? So let's do a little bit of a review. We'll start off with a cube in the scene. And so if you want to get rid of that, remember you can hit X and delete that, or go through the object menu. To move around in the 3D viewport, you want to use your middle mouse button for all 3 methods of movement, okay? So middle mouse button, click and drag to rotate around the 3D viewport, just like this. And you'll get a feel for kind of how this works as you play around with it. To zoom in and out on your 3D scene, you just use the scroll wheel and your middle mouse button to scroll in and out. And then to move around left, right, up and down, all you gotta do is hold shift on your keyboard while you middle click and drag, and that will let you move around, okay? So those three things are really the only things you need to remember to get around in your scene. And everything else has to do with moving an object around, which we've shown you how to do with the global manipulation widget down here, okay? So once we start playing with objects, there's a lot of cool things that we can do to get in here and start creating custom things with these objects. And you'll notice here we have lots of different kinds of objects. So we've talked about some 3D objects that we can add to the scene. These are called meshes. And meshes are made up of polygons, which are faces, and then edges that are connecting those polygons together, and then vertices, which are connecting all the edges together. And so if you've taken any sort of geometry basics class in school, you've probably heard of these terms before. And so let me jump in and show you kind of what these look like in Blender. So to access the individual pieces of a mesh, what you have to do is enter something called edit mode. And so to do that, all you have to do is jump down to our menus down here in the 3D viewport. Once you have your object selected, you can left click on this mode down here. And right now we're in object mode. And if you left click on that, you can pick another mode to get into. So right now we want to edit the object. So we're going to go to edit mode. Okay. Now with this selected, you'll be able to see all the pieces that make up an object. So we have vertices that you can see right here. And right now we have this object this option selected down here at the bottom, which is the vertex view. And if you want to switch to edges, you can select this middle button here, and that will let you select the edges of the cube. And I'm still just using right click to select these. So there we go. And then you can select faces by using this option. And each one of these options will allow you to manipulate a different part of the mesh. And so if you want to do any of the sort of operations we've done to the object, you can do the same operations in edit mode for moving, rotating, or scaling. So let's say we want to move this face in and out on the y-axis. Once we have the face selected in edit mode, we can now left click and drag on that arrow, and that will effectively make the cube fatter or shorter, fatter or skinnier based on how this face is moved in and out to change the width here. We can also rotate using this here, and you'll see how that affects the cube. Just like that. You can do any sort of custom rotation that you want. And then of course we can scale this as well. So if you want to scale it, make it a little skinnier, we can do that. And scale it on the Z axis, shorten it up a little bit. And let's say it's getting a little too slanted to the right. Switch back to our rotate tool and then just pull that back a little bit. And this is how you can start customizing objects. So no matter what object you have in here, whether it's a cube or a sphere or something else, any of the faces on this object can be manipulated and changed with these basic tools. And this is really all you need to get in here and start playing with things. So this is just faces that we've been manipulating so far. You can also do the same thing to edges. And so if we select edge mode, we can right click on individual edges. And now let's say we want to move those around. We'll click this and turn it back into our move tool. Now we can just move one edge, right? Move this left or right like this, kind of slant it. We can also do the same thing with vertices. And so we're getting into bigger pieces and then getting into more and more specific pieces. So faces are the biggest, and then we have edges, which are individual sides connected by two vertices. And then we have vertices, which are just points in space, right? And it takes all of these things together that add up and connect to each other to create a mesh. And meshes can be simple, like this cube, or complex, like characters. So once we have vertex selection enabled, now we can just move single pieces of our mesh around to customize how those are sitting in 3D space. And since we're connected with faces between these vertices and edges, it's going to dramatically shift and change how this object looks in space here. Now, if you want to manipulate more than one piece of an object at the same time, when you right-click and select a piece of an object or anything, in Blender, all you have to do to select more than one object is hold Shift while you right-click another object. So I'm going to pick this vertex right here, right-click. Let's say I want to select this vertex at the same time. I can hold Shift and right-click again over here. And now you're going to see both of these selected in the 3D viewport. In fact, I can keep going and just continuously click around with holding Shift and right-click to get more and more things selected. Till eventually, if I select all 4 of these vertices, I actually have not only just the vertices, but I have edges selected right here as well. And I have a face selected right here. And anything that you have selected, of course, will be highlighted in that sort of bright orange color. And so with these all selected, now when I move, those are all going to move at the same time. And so using just these really basic commands, you can get in here and really start to customize things and make things your own. So let's get out of editing this object back into object mode. Go down here to edit mode, and we'll switch this back to object mode. So now you can see all of our changes have been saved. They're permanent now. The way they are, and we can't really manipulate that again until we get back into edit mode, okay? So all of that stuff's gonna stay the way it is. So in object mode, now we go back to actually changing the whole object's rotation in 3D space, the position, and so on and so forth, the same way as we had before. So let's get rid of this object. We'll hit X on the keyboard and delete this. Let's add something a little bit more interesting. Let's add something right here. Let's call the monkey and add this to our scene. Now, this is a default object that comes bundled with Blender, and this is sort of the mascot of Blender called Suzanne. This monkey will give you a lot to play with as you're starting to learn these tools and get around inside Blender. And so what you can do is practice rotating this in place. And I might practice trying to sit this evenly on the ground, right? So let's bring this up and try to get it to sit on the ground where it's not going through the grid there. That's a good practice. Help you kind of position things more accurately. Maybe something like that. And now that we have it sort of sitting on the ground here, maybe what we want to do is add an actual ground instead of just having this grid sit here. So what we can do is add a plane. Sorry about that. We can add a plane here, and now it'll actually look like she's sitting on the ground plane, just like that. Now let's scale the plane up a little bit because we want it to be a little thicker, right? So we'll pull it out a little bit this way on the x-axis. Then we can pull it out a little bit on the y-axis. And now it's got, our scene has got sort of a ground that she can sit on, just like that. So let's make sure she's where we want her to be. You can see she's going through the bottom a little bit. So let's switch back to our move tool. And I'm just gonna pull up a little bit on the blue arrow to get her above the ground. And there we go. So now we wanna get in here and maybe start playing with her in terms of how she looks, okay? So let's go back to edit mode when we have her selected. Jump down to object mode down here, open this box, and now select edit mode. And now all of these are going to be selected. But to deselect these, what we can do is go into the select menu and just click the deselect all command down here. And that will make sure nothing's selected. And the same command can be used to select everything. So click this button again, and that will select everything. Now you'll notice again, that shortcut is A on your keyboard. And so if you're out here in the 3D viewport and you hit A, it will select or deselect everything in your scene. And so if we're in object mode right here, and I want to select everything or deselect everything, it's the same exact command as in edit mode. So let's jump back into object mode here. And let's start playing around with some of these pieces of this monkey. So we could take parts of the eye here, and let's switch back into face mode. And I want to select all of these pieces in this sort of pizza pie shape here. So I'm going to hold shift and I'm just going to right click each one of these to select these. And now that those are selected, let's play with scaling these a little bit. Okay. So we can scale this in, scale this in, scale this down a little bit. And we just tweak it a little bit until we get it to where we want it to be, right? We can do the same thing over here. And all of this basic stuff like this is really good practice to sort of get a feel for how to use these tools and get more accurate with them. Because using these basic manipulation tools are what it's going to take to create custom characters and levels and things like that for games or movies and all of that stuff. And so you need to get used to getting in here and playing with tweaking things like this. And so she's a really good first mesh to start playing with to see how these all work. And so again, now we can select individual vertices. It can't really scale a vertex because it occupies, no space. It represents a position in 3D space. So you can't rotate a vertice by itself. You can't scale a vertice by itself, but you can move a vertice. So we could select maybe these 3 vertices on the front of her brow and then pull these back in the y-axis. And now what you're doing is you get in here and you start moving these around as you're modeling. And this is all modeling is actually tweaking and making changes, right? Now with 2 of these selected over here, because we don't just have one vertex selected, if we switch this to the scale command, we can actually scale these apart because those aren't just single vertices. So we can scale that distance between them. And of course, just like with anything, when you right click and select one of these pieces of this mesh, there's also going to be an X, Y, and Z coordinate right here that lets you kind of move this around in 3D space. So if you have a really specific position you want to use here, you can type that in and also do that manually over here. So I know there's a lot we're going through and we're kind of trying to pick up on the basics today. So I don't want to overwhelm you guys too much with everything that we're doing. But what I'd like to do is show you a little bit more about how we're going to get in and kind of start manipulating things. So the goal for this week is for me to take you through a little bit about how we're going to build an entire scene using the entire 3D production pipeline that I just showed you. And so what I'm going to do is kind of switch back real fast to my webcam and just kind of talk to you about today's goals. So today is going to be basically an overview of some more of the features of Blender, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this week's project. And for this week's project, I didn't want to get anything built for you guys that was going to be too overwhelming, and I didn't know how much to dial it back, but I decided to go pretty basic. And so what we're going to do is create a basic low poly sort of forest scene, and we're going to animate sort of a daytime sun coming up and shifting the colors around, and then transforming that into a nighttime scene with the moon and all of that. And so it's going to be great project for a beginner to work on, nothing too intimidating. I am going to have to move kind of fast because we've only got 2 more days to do the whole thing. But tomorrow is going to be dedicated to pretty much doing all of the scene building and things like that for Friday, which is going to be the day that we animate the whole thing and render it out. So today we're going to get a little bit more into basics and talking that through. So if there's anything you guys want to know about, pop into the chat and ask me questions. I'll be happy to talk about that sort of stuff. I'll also be listening afterwards. So if you guys have anything that you would just like to comment on, I'll try to pop back in on YouTube or whatever and answer any questions you guys have. But this is the basic stuff you kind of need to know before you get into the really exciting stuff in Blender. So this is what we're going to do. Okay, so let's get back over to me kind of showing you what we're going to work on this week. So this is a render, as you can see here, of kind of one of the nighttime parts of the scene that we're going to work on. And basically, as you can see, we're just taking basic shapes that we've learned how to add to Blender today, and we're going to be doing a little bit more tweaking and customization and things like that. But there's not a whole lot of operations that I haven't shown you in this past hour or so. And so as we get further into today and you guys are practicing on your own, just make sure that you're kind of going back through the video today and taking a look at everything that I'm talking about in terms of how to get around Blender, how to move, rotate, and scale things, because that's really all you're going to need to know to be able to build the scene that you see here in front of you. So let's get back into Blender and play a little bit more with some other things for the next hour or so. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick drink. Okay, so let's talk about how to do some more manipulations on some other objects. So I'm going to get rid of the monkey here. Let's hit X and delete her. And let's talk about how to start modifying objects besides just moving and rotating and scaling an object, okay? So we have our plane here. I'm gonna make this a little wider. So let's grab our scale tool and pull this out a little more. Okay, so we're kind of getting it back to a little bit of a square here. And if we want to actually square this up, all we really need to do is make these X and Y values under scale over here the same number. So if we want it to be 3 and 3, we just type in 3 for both of those, and now that's a perfect square again. Okay, let's jump into edit mode. So let's go down here to this little box, left click edit mode. And now you'll know that with a plane, we only have 4 points, right? So we have 4 vertices. Those are connected with edges in between them. And of course, 4 points that are on a square make up a face, which in 3D we call a quad, okay? So what we want to do is we want to create some more things to play with on this mesh. Right now we only have 4 points, and that's not really that fun to play with. So we need to start looking at how to edit this. So if we look at our tools palette up here, instead of create where we've been looking, click the tools palette. Now you can see all these other options we have in terms of how to start playing with things in edit mode. So this menu will change a little bit depending on whether you're in edit mode or object mode. If we switch back to object mode, you'll see some of these options are shifting. So let's go back into edit mode and kind of see some of these things that we have at our disposal here. Now this is all going to be based on what you have selected and things like that in the 3D viewport. So as we go through some of these tools, just know that as you select different things, it will have different effects on your objects here. So I'll talk you through some of these things that are most useful. So the first thing I want to talk about is how to sort of add more edges and cuts through this plane right here. And so to do that, there's a tool here called Subdivide. So if we click this tool, right now, you'll notice that it doesn't do anything. And that's because we have a vertice selected, and you can't subdivide a vertice. So if we go to the move tool and try to move this around, nothing's going to happen because the only thing that can be subdivided are edges or faces. So if we jump to edge mode, and now we select an edge and then hit subdivide, we can subdivide that. Now it might not look like it, but there's actually 2 edges here. They're just butted up next to each other like this. So we can actually right click on one edge and it's only half of that mesh, or right click on the other edge and it's the other half of the mesh. And this will be more obvious if we start moving one of them around because the other one stays kind of in place. So that's one option you have for how to do things with the subdivide tools, to select an edge. I'm gonna undo this. Now let's go back to face mode and select this entire face. Now if we select subdivide, that's going to subdivide vertically and horizontally by the number of cuts you see down here in these options. So every time you select one of these tools and it does an operation, it's going to give you some options down here in the lower left-hand corner, depending on what your operation you're using. So with subdivide, it's going to give us this option for number of cuts. And so right now it says 1. If we click the right arrow, To increase that to 2, it's going to subdivide twice on the left to right and up and down this way. And you can, of course, do this multiple times all the way up to about 10. Okay? And so this is how we would add a lot more edges and faces and vertices to our base mesh. Now, this can be done for any mesh that you want. So as long as you have a selection that's an edge or a face, you're going to be able to subdivide it. This is really, really handy because now if we want to right click on just one of these here, when we start manipulating that, we can start making some basic objects. So by doing this, we can actually create what might look like sort of a ground that has hills. Okay. And so I'm doing this obviously the slow way, selecting one part at a time and kind of manipulating it. But this is basically how you would create a more complex model, is just edit this basic object like this until you're happy with the results. Okay, so let's jump back into object mode and take a look at how this is appearing. So now you can kind of see what that looks like. It's not looking great so far, but it's looking good enough that we could say that we've started our first model, right? So now let's go back into edit mode and let's play a little bit more with that subdivision. So remember I talked about how to select things with the select and deselect all. That's A on your keyboard. So I'm going to deselect everything, and then I'm going to hit A again to select everything here. So now we're going to subdivide all of these faces again. So let's click our subdivide tool. And you'll notice again, we're only at one cut here, but if we want to exponentially increase the number of faces we have to play with, we can just keep increasing this number. Now I wouldn't add too many faces because it's going to be a lot harder to get in here and manipulate them with the tools that we're using right now. But if you wanted to, that option's always there. So I'm going to take this back down to just one cut. Okay. Interestingly enough, if you look up here in the top section of the info bar, you're going to see how many faces we currently have on this object. So if you're trying to keep track of the number of vertices, edges, or faces, this up here will tell you in edit mode how many you have for this particular object. Okay, so now we can keep editing. So we'll right click on some pieces here, and now we can select more than one area and use our translate tool here to kind of play with these. And now we just keep tweaking this until we start finding some shapes that we're happy with as far as these hills and things like that go. And this is all I'm doing to create a basic environment for our scene. Just like this. Okay. So let's talk about one more thing that I think is pretty powerful that will help you sort of get in here and play with a lot of geometry all at the same time. Now, this is sort of a more intermediate type feature, but it's something that I think is really going to help you kind of get in here and play with things, and it's a lot of fun to play with. So let's talk about that. This is called proportional editing. So instead of manually selecting all of these edges one by one, and even grabbing a bunch of them with the same selection and then having to move those around, that's kind of, it takes a long time and it's boring and all of that. And so what we would rather do is be able to kind of select one face in an area, and then by just moving one face around, we can move the whole area around. That would be nice, right? So to do that, what we can use is something called proportional editing. So if we jump down here to the bottom, you'll see this little circle icon. So if we left click, you'll see that we have the proportional editing menu. And if we enable this, what we can do is we drag, is you'll notice a little circle appear on the outside, and that is our circle of influence for the proportional edit. And so now whether we're moving, rotating, scaling, whatever, that proportional influence is going to affect all the geometry, all the faces and edges and everything around that at the same time. And to change the area of influence while you're dragging with an operation, once you see that appear, and I'm still holding my left mouse button down right now and dragging, I'm just going to start scrolling with my middle finger on the mouse wheel to change that area of influence. So you can actually change a lot of the geometry simultaneously by making it a really big circle or just a little piece of it by scrolling up and changing that circle to a smaller circle. This is really handy. And so now we can just go around to various sections of our hill here, and we can decide for ourselves what we want to kind of influence and how much we want to influence by changing our circle here. And this is how I built the sort of hilly environment that you saw in that render, was by creating variation here, just playing with these hills a little bit. Okay. So this is pretty simple, and it takes a little bit of getting used to as far as using both the left and the middle mouse button at the same time if you're going to use the manipulation widget to move things around. But this is basically all you need to do to create a basic environment. Okay. And so now that we've got some basic hills in place, let's jump out of edit mode back into object mode. Take a look at what we have here. So this is pretty cool. We've got a little bit of a hill here. And now what we want to do is maybe you want to add some basic shapes here and create some trees, things like that, right? And so we're going to use some of the objects we've already talked about to create some basic representations of these objects. So for the tree trunks, maybe we'll use a cylinder, okay? So we'll left click here to create a cylinder. And you'll notice it's pretty big right now. And so what we can do right here is use our manipulator to start scaling this in place. And so we want the tree trunk to be skinnier, so we can scale in the X and Y. And if we want those to be the same, again, we just make these the same number. So let's say a 0.3 and a 0.3 for that tree trunk. And then let's say we want to make the tree trunk skinnier at the top than the bottom, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move this whole thing up a little bit higher. So it's kind of going into the ground, but it's higher up here. And let's jump into edit mode. And I just want to focus on the top section here. And I want to make sure that I can make this skinnier. So I'm going to hit A to deselect everything here. And we need to grab our edges or our vertices up here at the top. And so let's grab our edges. And so once again, we can hold shift and right click and go all the way around, but that's going to take a while, right? And so one of the things we can also do is we can use some of the other selection tools. And so if you go to the select menu, you'll notice that we have, other than select and deselect all, we've got circle select and we've got border select. Okay, so again, those are circle select for C on the keyboard, border select is B on the keyboard. So circle select basically lets you paint a selection. So this will put a little circle in your 3D viewport. And just like with the proportional edit here, you can scroll on your middle mouse button to make that bigger or smaller. And now when you left click and drag, it's going to start selecting points or edges or faces or whatever you have that you're in right here. So I'm going to hit escape to cancel that selection because we're done selecting things now. But you'll notice we selected too many areas down here. And so let's go back into our circle select. Again, we can go to select and select it here, or just hit C on the keyboard to bring that back up. And now if I want to deselect something with the circle select tool, I can just middle mouse button click and that will deselect. So left mouse button selects, middle mouse button deselects. So make sure we get rid of all of these that are not here. Hit C and middle mouse button click. Okay, so now we just have these top edges selected. And in fact, if we jump into the face selection mode, we just have one face right here at the top. So I want to actually scale this in a little bit. So let's jump to our scale tool. And we want to scale this in a little bit here, scale this in a little bit here, and we're trying to basically taper this so that it's gonna be a little skinnier at the top here. Okay, so one of the other tools that we have at our disposal, if we go to our tools palette, we've talked about subdivide. Let's talk about something called loop cut. So right here, you'll see it called loop cut and slide because it's actually two operations in one. And basically what we want to do here is, you know, we don't want it to just be one even taper all the way up to the top for our tree trunk. We want to add a little bit of variation in there. So we need more rings of edges around the middle so that we can create skinnier and wider places. So to do that, we are going to left click, loop cut and slide. And if I hover over this area right here in the tree trunk, you can see this little magenta circle appear, and that's going to tell me where the cut is going to be added. So if I left click now, it's going to start adding that cut. And as I move my mouse around, it's going to ask me where I want to insert that on the mesh. So I can left click anywhere in here to finalize the position of this. And then once I do, all of those edges are now locked into that position, okay? So now that we have those in place, we can scale just like we did up here. And I'm going to turn off my proportional editing. So let's select disable. So now we're going to scale just this little ring right here. And the great thing is once we have inserted with the loop cut and slide operator, it's going to keep that selected, whatever we just inserted. Okay, so let's make this a little skinnier. Let's add another loop cut in here somewhere. So let's grab the loop cut. You'll see the magenta circle appear as you get towards the object. Left click to accept, and then it's going to ask you where. So you just find a good position, left click again, and there you go. It's finalized. And then once again, let's play with the scale here. Let's add another loop cut down here at the bottom. So we'll add one there. Let's grab the, let's position it right about here, left click to finalize that, and then let's make it a little fatter at the bottom. Okay. So it's a little too fat. Let's pull it in a little bit. Okay. So one of the other things we might want to do is play a little bit with how these trees are shaped. So right now they're just going straight up and down, right? And we might want to play a little bit with the position. So let's jump to our move tool down here. And let's say we want to pull this part of the trunk out and over a little bit. It's going to wobble a little bit off to the side. And we might do the same thing up here. So let's hit A to deselect everything. And then I want to select just these edges going around the middle here. So I can select vertex mode. And then I'm going to hit C to bring up my circle select, drag a line. And let's rotate around and make sure we get every one of these vertices all the way around. Okay, so it looks like we've got all of them now. And now let's just go ahead and wobble this a little bit over this way with the move tool. Just like that. Let's add in another loop cut down here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to wobble a little bit, create a little bit of a curve here for this tree trunk. So you see how that's kind of an S curve like that. So there we go. Once again, I want to move this middle ring around a little bit. So let's hit C, left click and drag, and we'll select those. We'll hit C again and grab those. So we get all of them selected. And then let's move this around. Something like that. There we go. Okay, so let's get out of edit mode now. Jump down here and click object mode. Now we've got a basic tree trunk, okay? Hey, Lauren, good to see you. So I just had somebody enter the chats. Good to see you. Glad you're here. Yeah, I had to do today a little differently because my wife's birthday is today. So stream was a little earlier than I wanted. But yeah, tomorrow and Friday will be at the same time. All right, so let's now add in some leaves. So we're going to keep pretty basic. We don't want to get too advanced or anything like that because our scene is going to be pretty simple. But to do this, it's going to be really easy. All we're going to do is add in some icospheres. So these icospheres are really pointy and triangular spheres here. And once we add one to our scene, we'll just use our little move tool down here to position this up in the top. of our tree. That's pretty big. So let's scale this down. And this time I'm going to type in some values. So let's just type in 0.6, 0.6, and 0.6. So we can scale that down. And now let's talk about adding in some more leaves in other areas of the tree. So for right here, we might start by moving this around a little bit more so where it's not directly center like that. So it's a little offset. And now let's talk about taking an object that we already have in the scene and duplicating it, right? Because I don't want to have to continually add more of these and then tweak all the settings and just to get basically the same thing we have here, right? So to duplicate an object, again, we have a tools palette here, and you can, once you have an object selected, just left click on the duplicate commands, and that'll immediately, once you left click and start moving your mouse around, that'll duplicate and reposition the object somewhere. And to get it to a place where you're happy, you can just left click to accept wherever that is. Well, let's say I'm not happy with that, so let's just hit X and delete that. I'm gonna do this again. So duplicate, left click, and then I can start moving, and anywhere I click in the scene, if I left click, it's going to put it there. Now, if I don't want to move it around and I want it to be in the exact same place, I can just right click and that'll cancel the move part of the operation and put it right back here. Now there's still two objects sitting on top of each other. So now if I start moving one of them that's selected, you'll see that there's actually two pieces, two different meshes there. And again, these are all separate objects. So any one of these, if I want to go into edit mode, I can jump down here and start playing a little bit with how these look. So rather than scaling them, we can turn on our proportional edit again. And now I can play with how this is looking using that command that we just kind of learned, okay? So this is how you can start getting in here and shaping some basic trees around. Okay. And what's going to be good here is adding variation. So maybe these are going to be points, some a little smaller like that. And let's go to edit mode, customize this one a little bit. So we'll grab a little point here. Got our proportional edit on at the bottom. Grab and drag. So let's right click and we can move here. Okay. Let's say we start moving and it's a little too much. Again, we can just scroll down while we're left clicking and dragging. Scroll with our middle mouse button to increase or decrease that influence. Okay. And this is a really basic way to edit, but it's fast, which is why I like it. So we're just looking for an interesting silhouette here for our tree. And we can just keep doing this until we have a bunch of branches and leaves actually in the right place. So let's say we want to rotate this one a little bit. Rotate that around. There we go. And eventually you'll get to a point where you have enough happening that you're happy with, where the tree can just kind of be done in terms of the model, okay? And that's what you're aiming for, is you're aiming to get it pretty much to where even in a grayscale like this, it looks good. Okay, so you can think of sort of like a Mario style video game. This is kind of, you know, low poly, what they would be doing for something like that. So again, we can duplicate, move one of these down. Let's vary it up a little bit. We'll scale it, right? Say we jump into edit mode and we're like, this is going through the tree trunk, so that's not really good. We want to make sure that's not happening. So we'll bring it up a little bit here. Okay. Let's say we're happy with that. Okay. So now we got a tree, but obviously we're going to need a whole forest. So this is not really going to be good to leave by itself. And obviously all the trees aren't the same either. So you'd want to spend some time getting in here and playing with different kinds of tree trunks and different sizes of leaves and all that. But this is essentially how you get in here and you start modeling. in an easy way. So the part that we have to start talking about now is how to organize a scene a little bit, because we've got all these objects around here, and of course nothing's labeled, nothing's connected or anything like that. And so you've got all these individual pieces. And what we want to have is a much more organized scene so that when we click on an object, it's the whole object. So we don't just want the leaves by themselves. We don't just want the trunk. We want the whole tree, okay? So to start combining these together at the very basic level, we want all the leaves to be together, right? So let's grab all of these meshes that are leaves that we've added and manipulated, and let's make them one big object, okay? So we'll hold shift and right click on all of the pieces of the tree that are just gonna be the leaves here. And I've only added 4 here, 4 big pieces. So once we have all of these, we want to make them into one connected mesh. And so anytime we jump into edit mode, it's going to see that as one object. And so what we have to do is we have to select all of these. You'll notice some of these are darker orange, and then there's one of them that's brighter orange on the outside. The brighter orange one is the last one we selected, and it's the one called the active object. Okay, now the active object is important because this is the one that all the other objects are going to get combined into, and you'll see what I mean as we get going here. So once again, I'm going to right click one object, hold shift, right click again, and then right click again. And here we go again. The last object I selected is the active object. So now we can go over to our tools palette and use the join command. And now you'll notice everything has been surrounded by that bright orange outline. And that's telling me that I have one object selected and that it's the active object, okay? So the reason the last one I selected and that being the active object was important was you'll notice that the middle of this object has this little orange dot. And this orange dot is called the origin of the object. And that's important because anytime we move, rotate, or scale the objects, the origin is what it's moving, rotating, and scaling around, okay? And so when you combine a bunch of objects into one object, whatever the active object's origin is, that's the origin that it uses for all the other meshes now, as it's combined into one giant mesh. So now as we move, rotate, and scale, it's going to be doing it around this object. So Lauren's got a question. She says, when you combine objects, can you still separate them later? And yes, you can. It's a great question. So let's say we've already gone in and started playing with combining all these leaves, and we're not happy with that. We want to separate them out for whatever reason. Doesn't matter, but we want to do that. Let's go into edit mode. And now you'll see, again, those are all connected and seen as one giant mesh object. Even though they're separate in terms of not really connected, Blender sees them as one object. So when you have these connected like this and you want to separate them out, what you need to do is select the pieces that you want to be separate so that Blender knows which ones you want to separate out again into a separate object, and you're going to use the separate command. So let's see if we can find that under the tools palette over here. Not seeing it, so let's go under mesh, faces. Sorry, I don't use the menus that often, so I'm trying to go through and remember where this is. So here is a good example of a situation where I can't find a menu command anywhere in these menus down here, but I need to know what it is, right? I know it by name. And so one of the things I can do over here, if I know that it's called separate, is I can hit spacebar, and that will bring up a menu that allows me to search right here. If I left click that, I can start typing in the name of a command like separate. And if you look under the left side, you'll see a category for that command. And then you'll see the command. And then again, you'll see the keyboard shortcut if it has one over here on the right side. And so separate is what you want. And then you can separate by the selection that you have, by a material that you've assigned, or by loose parts. And in this case, if you wanted to separate all the pieces that are leaves that have not been actually joined and connected on a mesh level, which they haven't, they've only been connected on an object level, you could use the loose parts command. So let's start with the selection. So with selection, you'll notice that now they turn gray. You'll see the vertices and the edges disappear. So let's jump back into object mode. And now you'll notice I can select this object, pull it away, and all of those leaves go with it except for the pieces that I separated, okay? And now those are two separate objects. So this has its own mesh now when I go to edit mode. So let me undo this. So now they're joined back together because I'm undone until then. Now if I use the separate command, and the keyboard shortcut for this is P on the keyboard, I can separate by loose parts, okay? Now this takes every object or every mesh in the object and separates it based on any pieces that are loose and not connected. So now if we jump back into edit or object mode, now I can right click and select all of these individually again. So that's how you would separate based on any loose pieces that are floating out there, okay? So Lorian has another question. Does the join command have a keyboard shortcut? Yes, it does. So the way you would find that, again, we're going to talk a little bit now about how to go digging up the keyboard shortcuts because that's important. So I have all of these selected and I want to join them. We've got several areas to find the join command. So under the tools palette, we have it right here. If you just hover over, you'll see a tooltip that'll say shortcut Control J. So every single command that has a keyboard shortcut should tell you if you hover over it with a tooltip, okay? I'm gonna get another drink real fast. So that's one way to figure out what the keyboard shortcut is and how to start memorizing them, is to use the tooltips. The other thing is if you dig through a menu and you look at any of these commands, again, the keyboard shortcut will be on the right side, labeled right here. And you can also go to File, jump down to your user preferences, and then go to Inputs. And all of these settings right here are commands inside of Blender. And so if we open one of these up and start looking at mesh, and then you start seeing specific commands here. Let's try to find one that we know how to use. So we have duplicate. Well, that's a different kind of duplicate. So let's find, here we go, deselect or select all. So you see keyboard, it's not a mouse shortcut, it's a keyboard shortcut. You hit A, and this is the keyboard shortcut that you have. Now, if you left click this, you can reassign a custom keyboard shortcut, and that's how you would do that. So let's talk a little bit more about the separate and unseparate command, because that can be a little confusing depending on the language we're using. Lauren says, I don't understand about loose pieces. Does that bring back the original ISO sprues that you made, or are they lost once you join them? So understanding that first, again, language is really important here. So if we are in object mode, everything that we're touching and selecting are called objects. And so anything that we're doing to these objects is happening on an object scale. So none of the individual pieces inside are really being touched. Everything that we're scaling here is on the whole object, okay? Once we jump into edit mode, all of these pieces are inside of the object are called basically a mesh, okay? And the mesh is made up of, again, faces and edges and vertices. Now, these are all connected. They're literally joined. So no matter what I do to anything on this sphere that we've kind of moved around into a blob at this point, if I move this vertice around, let me turn off my proportional editing here. So you just see this one vertex moving around. You can see how the edges go with it and the faces. That's because it's literally connected, okay? So what's not literally connected, even if I join these other objects in together with this object in object mode to make this one giant mesh, none of these areas where they overlap are actually glued together. They're not connected the same way that these are connected. Okay, so let me show you what that means. If I select this leaf object and I select this leaf object and I join them together with Control J, or I use this button over here to join them together, and then I jump into edit mode, you can see that even though I use this to manipulate this vertice right here, or I manipulate this vertice right here, and there's some overlap happening, they're not joined, okay? That means I can literally select every single piece of this mesh object that is connected, and then if I move it, Blender is not going to confuse that and see them as actually joined, okay? Because to Blender, we literally just have a huge collection of vertices, edges, and faces that are kind of floating around in 3D space together. And all we've done is we've really told Blender, okay, I want you to see these as one giant object while we're in object mode. But while we're in edit mode, I want to have the freedom to do whatever I want to this object without having to, really join them together. And I can show you that if I jump into wireframe mode using this viewport shading menu down here. Typically we're in solid mode, but if I jump into wireframe mode, you can see that they're overlapping, and all that geometry that you can't see that's tucked away, it's still there. Okay, so I can still move that around and manipulate it and all of that. It's not connected. And yeah, so that's kind of the way it works. So a good way to think about that, and Lauren kind of pointed this out just now, is she's saying, so join is kind of like group in Photoshop. And yeah, that's a great way to kind of point this out, is you're literally telling Blender, okay, on a bigger level, think of these as, connected, but I don't really want them to be merged, right? We're not going to put them into one layer, okay? And there's a great way to visually see this if you look in the outliner over here on the right. So I'm going to jump back out of object mode over here. Now remember, we just joined these together. So they're two meshes that are joined together as one object, but they're still separate meshes, right? So this icosphere right here, let's scroll down to the name down here, and I'm going to call this leaves, just so we can see it better over here on the right side. This is called the outliner, and the outliner is kind of like layers in Photoshop. It basically organizes your entire scene and shows you where all of your objects and lights and everything in your scene are. So if we look at the list here, we can see the leaves object that I just named. And if we open this up, hit the little plus icon, you can see that we have icosphere 3. So again, when we join these two together, it sees them as one mesh, right? But if we click this, it automatically takes us into edit mode. And clearly, if this went further down in and listed off every single polygon, which it doesn't, but if it did, we would see a whole giant list of separate pieces, because again, they're not the same. They're not really connected, okay? Now in object mode, they are. I move them around in object mode, they're connected, but they're not in edit mode. So that's one way to think of it, as grouping. Now that's important that we kind of differentiate that a little bit, because there is such a thing as a grouping in Blender, which means that you can literally put objects in the same group by name. But again, even in object mode, they're not going to be seen as one object. They're just part of a group. You've also got parenting, which we can talk about a little bit. And that's where you have a hierarchy, where you have a parent object. So you might have a car object, and inside that car object, you would have wheels, right? Or doors, and those would all be separate objects, but they're parented to the car object as a whole. So that way, when you grab one object that represents the car, all of those other pieces go with it. So if you're trying to animate a car going down a road, that's what you would end up doing. So let's take a look at the chat a little bit more. I'm going to answer a few more questions and then kind of get back into what we're doing. Let's take a look. So Augustine says, I need help. If you have any specific questions, man, just let me know, and I'll be happy to jump in and take a look at any problems as we go. So yeah, try to be specific. And again, I'll help you with anything you need. Lorian has one more question. How did you just select the whole object to move it? So in object mode, since again, we join those together into one object, anytime I right click on that object, it's going to see that as one object, okay? So in edit mode, I can individually select every single piece that's joined together and connected, and I just move each mesh individually, okay? Or again, I can select everything and move everything together as a whole. So I know it's a little confusing, but trust me, once you get in here and start playing with it, you'll understand a little bit more about that. It's really important that this is the way that it works, because if you actually started joining objects together and then they automatically merged and that geometry like got deleted or they overlap and stuff like that, it would be really hard to make any complex sort of interactions happen within the 3D stuff. So anyways, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get in here and play with it. But yeah, once you've joined these together, let's say I have the rest of these leaves here, right? And I want those all to be joined to the same object so that they're all connected, right? Well, I don't want to have to select these all every single time I want to move all the leaves. So once I have all this selected, once again, I'll just click join. And now again, you'll see them be hierarchically grouped in the object outliner. And now we just have one object that says leaves. Inside of that object, we have a bunch of disconnected spheres that are individually overlapping each other. And any one of those can be manipulated just as if those were separate objects. And we're creating the illusion that they're connected, but they're not really connected, right? So you can think of connecting different objects into a single object kind of as like temporarily gluing them together because they're not really joined. Okay, so that's how we would do one giant leaf object. Now we still have a trunk object, okay? So let's rename this here, call this trunk. Now these aren't connected right now. So we've got this object, which we'll call the ground. And now we've got every single object in our outliner sort of named over here. Now, the leaves and the trunk are actually a tree, right? So we want to have a way to group them or make them, you know, as one object so that whenever we move it around, it makes kind of sense, right? Because otherwise we're going to be duplicating two kinds of objects to create a forest over the entire area. So the best way to do this in this case would be to parent, okay? So what we need to do is decide, do we want the trunk to be parented to the leaves and set up a hierarchy that way? Or do we want the leaves to be parented to the trunk? And in this case, I think I want the leaves to follow the trunk around, okay? So the first thing we have to do is select the leaves, and then we're gonna right click and select the object that these are gonna be parented under. So the leaves are gonna become a child of the trunk, okay? So let's hold shift and right click on the trunk. And now to put the leaves under the trunk and parent them, what I'm gonna do is hit Control P, which will bring up the parent command. Now, if you can't remember that keyboard shortcut, remember we can hit spacebar and search parent. And we've got a lot of different options here for parents. So we want to make sure we're under the one that's under the object tool set because we're in object mode. Okay, and we have make parent. And you can also find this under object here. If we dig into these menus and I'll have to find out where this is. Here we go. So under parent, you click objects and it's the same exact command. So there's three ways to find it right there. So let me show you how to do this really quickly, and then I'll get back and answer a few more questions out of the chat. So we're gonna look for parents. So Control P, and remember we're parenting the leaves to the trunk. So we hit object, here. And now you'll see the leaves disappear, but they're now underneath the object of the trunk, okay? So now anytime we select the trunk and we move it around, the leaves are gonna go with it, okay? Now that doesn't go both ways. So anytime we select the leaves and move those around, the trunk is gonna stay where it is. And you'll see this little dotted line here that indicates that parenting situation that we have going on, okay? So it only goes one way. So Lori had mentioned, shouldn't both the trunk and the leaves be parented to tree? And I would say in this case, yes, that's true. So another thing we can do here is create an object that represents the entire tree as a whole, because you'll see that we still have just a trunk and we still have just leaves, but we don't have a tree object. And so what I would typically do if I was going to be reusing this over and over and over again is I would create another object. So we'll go to the Create tab. And you'll notice an object here that is called an empty. Now an empty is basically just a location in 3D space, but it's not a mesh. There's no object there. It's just a placeholder for an object. It's basically just representing an object that's, an idea of an object, right? So let's add an object that's an empty to our scene, and you'll see it be represented by these little crosshairs right here. And you can actually change the way this looks by selecting from this little menu down here as you add it, all of these options for how to represent the empty. So we could select arrows. You'll see how that changes and it's actually labeled X, Y, and Z. And then we've got circle, cube. So there's all these different ways we can create an empty here. So let's say we were happy with maybe I don't know, let's say a circle. And I want to rotate this empty so that it's not up and down, but it's kind of sort of parallel to the ground. So let's select our rotate command. I'm going to rotate this like this until it's kind of going to surround the trunk of the tree. And that's about 90 degrees on the x-axis. And now let's move this into place so that it's sort of in the middle of the tree trunk. Just like that. And now I also want to scale it down a little bit so that it's not as big. Now I don't want to scale it using the X, Y, and Z here, because if we actually start parenting and doing all sorts of stuff like that, the tree will actually shrink to be this scale, because again, it's parented, right? So anything that is parented to something else follows the position, rotation, and scale of that parent. So what we need to actually do is change the size of the empty. So there's an empty command. If we look over here, and we can change the size here to smaller size. So we're just going to leave it a little bit thicker than the tree trunk right there. Let's call this empty tree. Okay, and now what we're going to do is select the trunk here, and then I'm going to right click while holding shift the empty for the tree. And now if I go to object, parent, and select object here, it's going to let me, again, parent to the object. And now you'll see everything going under that tree. So we have tree, and inside that we have a trunk, and inside that we have the leaves. So the leaves are connected to the trunk, and the trunk is connected to the entire tree, right? So now anytime we select this empty and we move it around, the whole tree is going to go with it. Okay? And this is just a really easy way to start creating controls that let you kind of manipulate bigger objects in your scene in an organized way. So now if we were to scale this empty, you can see if we drop all of these down to 0.5, the tree is actually going to shrink in size as well. Does that make sense? And in this case, again, we could have the leaves parented to just the tree instead of the leaves parented to the trunk, and then the trunk parented to the tree. It doesn't really matter, and it all depends on how you want to organize the hierarchy, but in this case, I think this works. And so now what we can do is whenever we want to create copies of this and move it around the scene is we just select all three of these, and then we can go to our tools palette, select duplicate, and now we can move that around, and we've got two trees, and these are all independent. So we can move those, scale them differently, and all of that. Rotate them. Okay. So you guys have any more questions right now about how that works? You guys still confused at all about the mesh and the object and edit mode and all of that stuff, or? So Lauren's wondering how we would parent both the leaves and the trunk to the tree. And it's the exact same process, even if they're already parented this way. So let me go ahead and delete this, this tree right here. And notice what just happened. I only had the empty selected. And even though these are hierarchically connected like this, if I just select the empty and I delete the empty, the original objects are going to go back to the position they were in before I parented everything. Okay. So remember that. Okay, so let's talk about this right here. Let's say we're not happy with the way these are grouped in terms of the hierarchy and the parenting. And we want the leaves to be parented to the tree just like the trunk is. So right now, all we have to do is select the leaves, and then we select the empty or the tree, which is the same thing. And now we can hit Control P, and we say set parent to object. Okay. Now you'll notice again, it moved back to the original position that it was in before we parented. So let's undo that with Control Z. And you notice two options when I hit Control P. One's object and one is object keep transform. And that's basically going to say no matter what we've done up until this point, moving, scaling, anything these objects around, I want you to keep them in the same place they're in right now when we reparent everything around, okay? So if I select this, it's all going to stay in the same place. And now you'll notice this switches around to where we have the trunk and the leaves both under the tree here. So if you're happier with that, that's how you would set that up. Okay. Okay, we don't have too much time left today. Tell you a little bit about what we're going to do as we get in here tomorrow. We're going to finish adding a little bit of really basic shaders to the scene so we can add some color to this. We're going to add a sun and some lighting into the sky, and we're going to talk about how to start setting everything up to where we have a camera and all that sort of stuff. And we'll also go over some more tools. But for right now, for the last 10 minutes, let's talk a little bit about how to finish out the scene here. So we need to duplicate this tree around to create a forest. And there's a lot of ways we can do this. So the two things I want to talk about right now. To do this, remember, you have to have, you can't just select the tree by itself, right? You can't select the empty because the empty isn't the entire object. The empty is just the idea of the tree. So we can duplicate this, but we're only going to get more and more empties as we create those around the scene. So you need to think of the tree and the empty as controllers of the tree, okay? They're not actually the tree. So you still need to select all three of these big objects that represent the tree to create a new tree. And once you have those three selected, you can click the duplicate command and you'll be able to move a new tree into place. And then of course, you can just select the empty and you can rotate the tree into a new position, and then you can scale it a little bit and make it a little taller. You might scale it uniformly by changing all three of these at the same time. So maybe 0.8 makes it a bigger tree, just like that. And something like that, okay? So once again, I'll start off by kind of rotating into a top-down view like this. And then I just want to hit duplicate and move a bunch of trees around the scene, okay? This is, if you're starting off, this might be the quickest way to kind of get everything set up so that you're not going to have to do this really, really slowly over and over again. So first thing is get a bunch of trees kind of laid out all over the place. And you want to kind of randomize the position a little bit. You don't want them all bunched up together. And then what you want to do, again, is you want to just select the little circles and you want to kind of move them around and rotate them into new positions, because you don't want them all to be the same size. You don't want them to all be bunched up in the same grid-like pattern from the top down. And so put a few trees really close to each other. Don't be afraid to, see there I selected the trunk instead of the empty. So make sure you grab that circle. So don't be afraid to let the leaves kind of overlap, because in a real forest, you know, in a canopy, that happens. They bunch up pretty close to each other and then they get in each other's way. So don't be afraid to kind of do that. Remember, the ground is uneven, so you can change the height a little bit as you're playing with this. And then of course we can change the scale. So every one of these trees needs to be a little bit different size. If you don't want to make it sort of a really stylized scene, you can have various sizes that are all over the place. But if that's a little bit too weird, I would say scale them up and down by a 0.1 all over the place. And that's a great way to kind of get started playing with how big these are. Okay. So we can go around now and just kind of play with the rotations a little bit. Really quickly kind of get these randomized. They're in a better place. If you want to switch in and out of wireframe, you can do that using this command menu down here under viewport shading, wireframe, or solid. Or if you want to really quickly do that while you're zooming around the 3D viewport, if you hit Z, that'll toggle wireframe on and off for your scene here. So Lauren's asking, do we still have control over the trunks and the leaves separately to scale and reshape them? And the truth is, with the regular duplicate command, yes, we do. So if we jump into this tree right here and we're like, well, I want to make them look different than all the other trees, and I edit this, then it's going to only edit this one tree, okay? So let's just play a little bit with the shape and say, all right, let's flatten that out a little bit. This one, you know, we'll take up on this side, make it a little bit different looking, just like that. And so every single one of these is able to be customized like this, okay? And I would recommend, if you're just starting out, definitely take the time to make your scene a little bit more interesting by doing this, okay? So there's an important difference here that I want to talk about, and that is the difference between the duplicate command and the duplicate linked command, because that option you were talking about having them all separate is optional. So let's say we have two trees here and we want them to be the same all over the entire forest, right? And there's a lot of reasons why you would want to do this. One of the big reasons is that it saves a whole lot of computer memory when you're dealing with a forest that has hundreds of thousands of trees. If, let's say you're doing a photorealistic render and you want your one basic type of oak tree or something to be duplicated in an entire forest of oak trees. You got to remember, every realistic tree is going to have, you know, dozens of branches, thousands of leaves, and then you multiply that times, you know, thousands of trees, and you've got tons and tons of geometry floating around the scene, and unrealistically so. So what a lot of people do is they will use the duplicate linked command to make sure that they're saving memory. And what that does is it basically does the same thing as a duplicate command. But now what happens is when you place two objects that have everything linked here, and you scale one of them in edit mode in terms of, and you manipulate it, it's going to link that object data back over. So in object mode, you can make changes and nothing will really happen. But if I go into edit mode on either one of these objects and I grab a piece here and I change the way that looks, it's going to change the way the other object looks because they're linked. The data is shared. And you can see that by looking at the object data panel right here. And I can see icosphere 0.21 or 0.021. And I can see right here, 2 objects in my scene are sharing that data. And that's because I use duplicate linked, okay? So you'll also notice when I go in and out of edit mode on either one of these objects, both objects are in edit mode, even though I didn't select this object for edit mode. And it's because, again, they're sharing the data. Blender sees them as the exact same object. So again, when I manipulate one vertice over here, it's manipulating the exact same vertice on this tree. No matter how it's rotated, no matter how it's scaled or any of that, it's going to kind of tweak that around. So again, if you're looking for a really simple way to get the same types of trees used everywhere, again, this could be useful for taking 2 or 3 types of trees that you've customized and then only duplicating those 2 or 3 types of trees around the forest. Because even with 2 or 3 different variations, you're going to get so much difference in the way that those can look when they're rotated and scaled that you may not need every tree to be 100% different looking, right? I mean, you can take some shortcuts. So one more time, let's go over the difference a little bit here with object and edit mode. Object mode is for any objects in your scene that you're adding from this panel over here. They can be added from the add menu down here under mesh. And you've got different types of objects, curves, surfaces, text, and any of this stuff. Cameras are objects. But meshes are primarily what you're going to be using for representing objects in your world, your environments that you're creating. And so you're going to create an object here. And objects, again, think of it as a way to organize your scene from general to specific, okay? So an object, a good example of an object would be a car, or the idea of a car. So you're going to add a Honda to your scene, right? And every time you want to move the Honda around and you're trying to animate it, you don't want to have to think of it as wheels and an engine and a gas tank and doors. And you don't want to have to do that. You want to just be able to say, I want to manipulate the car, right? That's an object. Edit mode is for manipulating pieces of an object, okay? And those are called elements. So if we go from object mode, let's say we're going to grab this ground plane here. We go from object mode to edit mode, using this menu at the bottom here. These are elements, vertices, edges, and faces are all 3 types of elements that make up meshes in a 3D environment. And so any one of these selection options down here can be used. This one's just for faces, this one's just for edges, and this one's just for vertices. And again, these are like the tires and the wheels and the car doors and the gas tank and all the different pieces and elements that make up a car. This would be the idea here. And any one of these can be manipulated separately. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of these other objects in the object menu, because Lorian is asking kind of how to differentiate those. So objects, again, remember, it's a representation of an idea of something in a 3D world, okay? So objects are not all meshes, right? Some of them are meshes. You can see them labeled here under mesh. You have plane, cube, circle, all this stuff. We also have curves, okay? Curves are not meshes. They're a different type of object. And if you're used to working in Illustrator or Photoshop, you know what a curve is. It's got points and it defines, you know, a mathematical description of how a curve is created inside of a computer system. Then we have objects that are lamps. Lamps are things that add light to the scene. We've got things that represent the sun, and point lights are like light bulbs and candles and things like that. And again, we'll get a little bit more into this tomorrow, but so those are also objects. And then you also have objects down here like text. So if we have an actual object that just represents adding handwriting or something to labels in the scene, and I don't use that a lot, but it's there. We also have armatures. Armatures are another word for skeletons. And so if you want to add bones and stuff to an animal or a human, armatures are what you would use. Those are objects. edit mode is called pose mode when you're working with armatures, because you're editing the bones and the positions and moving them around. And when you animate in pose mode, okay? And then you've got a lot of other objects. We talked about empties. I don't use speakers a lot. They're more for like game engine type stuff where you're setting off like a sound effect to happen when someone walks over a certain area in the game engine. And then you got cameras. Cameras are objects. So this is how we actually render things. We have to have a point of view because we're editing our entire scene, kind of zooming around in 3D space, but we're acting kind of like God right now, right? Moving around. Well, the viewer is going to have to experience this somehow. And so we're going to have to add a camera that lets us give everybody a common way to see the scene, okay? And then we're going to talk about framing things and different lenses we can use for the camera and all that sort of stuff. So tomorrow what I'm going to do is we're going to talk about how to animate a scene in Blender. So let me kind of save a copy of this. I'm going to open the scene that I kind of worked on for this week's stuff. So this is basically what we talked about today. We talked about adding a little forest and kind of modeling a tree and all of that. And this is me just doing what I talked about doing then and duplicating that around and creating basic objects and all of that. So what we're going to talk about doing is how to take all the basic geometry and we're going to add shaders. So we're going to create different colors for all these objects. And then we're also going to talk about animating all of these little elements. So we've got a star field back here that I put in, and then we've got something here that represents the moon. And I'm going to show you how to sort of represent a very simple animation of like a sun kind of going through the sky and setting, and then the moon rising and kind of animating into place. And we're going to talk really quickly. Well, it won't be quick, but it'll be easy in terms of how to get into animation. And so we're not going to talk about character animation. We're not going to talk about bones and all that kind of stuff because it's so complicated and you need to really take it slow when you're starting out. Because even animating simple stuff like balls bouncing around the scene, it's very complicated. And I know it doesn't sound complicated, but I promise when you get into animation, as complicated as modeling and sculpting are by themselves, animation is at least that complicated, if not a whole lot more so. And it's just because it involves physics. It involves learning how to make things move. And if you want to make it look good, it's just like when you're modeling or sculpting, you have to learn how to see things, you know, from reference correctly. You have to learn how to feel when something's off and how to fix it. And that just comes with a lot of practice. And animation's like its own little ball of wax, but I'll show you a really simple version of how to kind of move this through the sky and animate. And we'll also render that out. So this is sort of from the camera view that you can see here. And if I start kind of rendering this, you can see what it's doing a little bit. So there's a couple more questions in the chat while this is getting fired up here. I'll talk a little bit about what I see. So Lauren says, would you ever put more than one camera in a scene? You can. Some people will do that when they want to add a cut from one position in the scene to another. I typically just render two different cameras in two different files, and then I edit those together in post. But that's an option. So yeah, there are ways to do that. Also, if you want to have different alternate camera views in one scene just for testing purposes, so you can see how things look from different angles, that's another reason you might want to have multiple cameras in one scene. In terms of all these live recordings for anyone that's watching later, all you have to do is go back to my personal YouTube channel. You're watching it live right now on that. If you're on YouTube, it's just search Brandon W. Hicks or Brandon Hicks in the YouTube search. It's BRANDONHIX is my last name. You can also go to youtube.com/user/Brandon W. Hicks. And that's my channel. So any of the live streams ever that I've done in the past month or so are up. There's, I think there's more than 30 hours or so of live streams available to go back and watch. So at this point, if you caught the end of today's stream and you're not a beginner, but you want to go kind of see what we're working on in other areas, I've got a lot more advanced projects that I'm delving into in other weeks. And so this week is specifically for beginners. And tomorrow we're going to get back into tackling all of the beginner scenes and things that you're seeing today. So I want to thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to have to run, but I will be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. Central Time for all of that. The recording will start transcoding as soon as I go offline and then come back up live as soon as YouTube is done transcoding it. So sometimes that can be half an hour, sometimes it can be a couple of hours, but it will be up pretty much immediately afterwards for you to see parts of it. So check back tonight around my regular stream time if you want to wait for it all to be finished and uploaded and for you to see that. And that'll be available. Also check out the link in the bottom in the description if you want to get a month free at theorangeguild.com, which is my training website for Blender. Lorian's inside. She can tell you it's a lot of training. I'm available 24/7 to answer questions and everything like that. So definitely duck in and become a member. I'd love to see you guys in there. Hey, what's up, Kaita-kun? Good to see you. Sorry, it's end of the stream and I'm getting off now, but definitely come back tomorrow at 7 p.m. and I will be online and we will tackle some more of the scene. So thank you guys for tuning in and check the recording. And again, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye.